Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Helene. I'm a creative writer and transformation mentor, and I want to welcome you to Across Genres Creative Writing Week. And I want to thank you for joining in to this evening's final session of the week. And this one is on poetry. I want to tell you that if you missed any of the previous 4 evenings, please go back and check them out. We had some great sessions. The writers were wonderful, and there's a lot of good information in there. On Monday night, we did creative nonfiction. Tuesday was short story with the wonderful writer, Bridget Shade. On Wednesday, we had the amazing Maureen O'Brien covering memoir. And yesterday, on Thursday, we had the very talented and accomplished author, Jennifer Gavon, covering novel. I want to ask you to like and subscribe if you get a chance to the channel, and remind you that below the presentation, you'll see a link to my website where you can get in contact with me or find out current course offerings. And you also see some information there about tonight's guest speaker. And I want to remind you the live chat is up, so we'd love to hear from you at any point during the evening. And I'm very excited to welcome tonight the award-winning poet, Laurinda Lind. And I want to thank her for taking time out of her busy schedule to join us. And also mention that she too, like all of our writers, is an across-genre writer. So, Laurinda, if you wouldn't mind taking just a few minutes to introduce yourself to the audience, we'd appreciate it.
Hi, Karen. I have probably been writing poetry since college, I would say. And I thought I was a fiction writer. Turned out that poetry gave me more of the expansion that I needed in order to say what I wanted to say. Took an 18-year break from it, though, and I've been back in it for about 6 years. I have had probably since then about 300 poems published. I'd have to look at my list, but that sounds about right. So thank you for having me.
Lori, I wanted to mention, I think I put it in our notes about the prize that you won, where you actually got to travel to England, or to the UK, I should say. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That was in 2018. That was the Keats-Shelley Prize for adult poetry. It was an entry that I sent in along with all of my other submissions. I used to send out 3 to 5 poetry submissions a day, and that was just one of them. I shot out there to try to meet the deadline. Was very surprised to end up winning it, and I read that poem in London.
Yeah, that had to be an amazing experience to actually get to travel, especially out of the country, to be able to do that. I was thinking today as I was preparing, I was thinking of all the amazing poets that I love, and some of the later ones that you introduced me to. But I was actually talking about this to my mom recently, because when I was really young, she had a book of Ogden Nash poems. And I really liked those as a kid because of the rhyme and the fun, dandy candy kind of poetry. And that was probably really one of my earliest introductions until I started seeking on my own. And then, as you probably know, I came across Pablo Neruda and was blown away, and, Sylvia Plath. And then it just went on and on and on. Yeats and Linda Hogan, more recently. So I'm wondering, I could go on, and I'm not even, a poet. So I'm wondering if you can tell us some of your favorite poets over the years, if you had an early one, and who you follow now, and how they've impacted your particular writing, if they have.
Yeah, when I was in college, I was crazy about Dylan Thomas. And I also, when I really discovered poetry, I guess it went on from there to James Wright, Maxine Kumin, um, Anne Sexton, and I guess no, I should add Gary Snyder because he was an early person who opened poetry up for me. In later years, I went on to Naomi Shihab Nye, um, another poet that I was really influenced by in recent years was David Shumate. What I think all of these people have in common is a really creative use of language, surprising use of language.
Mhm. Do you find that you have tried to mirror that in your writing? Like, do you keep that in mind when you're writing? Maybe not all of your poetry, but does certain poems lend themselves to that? And if so, do you have any examples of your poetry you'd like to read?
Well, I'm always influenced by what I've been reading lately. So when you subscribe, I not subscribe, but when you submit to a lot of journals, then you get on the lot of journals email list, and your inbox is always full of poems, um, which is very useful if you are someone who's interested in writing poetry. A good rule is to read more poetry than you write. Write a lot and then read more than you write. Um, Especially when you start to submit, make sure that you read poems that the journals that you're submitting to have actually published, because the editor's taste and the editor's ethos and everything is not necessarily a match for yours. And you can find
Mm-hmm.
where you fit better by doing that. So anyway, I do have a poem right here. Um, I went to my binder of published poems, and I was in the A's, and I didn't have the patience to get past the A's. I was like, oh, this one is good, and I fished this one out. So this poem was published 2 years ago in the journal Reckoning, and it's called "Alive Between the Bands." In a 20-year temperature inversion, California walks into me through the windows of a hot car with no air conditioning. It's summer and the heater is full blast. It's a 100-degree day. I am younger and California is cleaner. The engine doesn't self-eject, and it jets out oil all across the country. This awful era of ourselves, we have nowhere to drive but down into it. The freeway folding over and under, everything settling, which also means seething. The old rocks with all the time in between them, and the road, only a ribbon of exhaust, held harmless between the jaws of a geologic age.
That's wonderful, Laurinda. Thank you for sharing that. I like the imagery in that poem. Um, and I think that's something that you do very well. I was thinking that as you were reading, wondering about truth in poetry. This came up earlier in the week, obviously with creative nonfiction and memoir. And yesterday with Jennifer Gavon, we talked a little bit about, we were talking about voice, and then she was saying in poetry, a lot of times people think that everything a poet writes is their exact experience. But just like in fiction, you can create a character in poetry. And I'm wondering if you find that most of your poems are personal, and then when you read them, do you think most people think that poetry is about the poet? So kind of two separate ideas there.
Well, first of all, I think probably most readers are going to assume if a poem sounds autobiographical that it is. I don't think a lot of people are going to guess that maybe it was a created character. I do have some poems like that. The one that I just read was autobiographical, and it was about a cross-country trip that we took with all 5 kids in a station wagon that broke down all the way across the country and then all the way back. And that was particularly about when we were in California. I have never smelled air so as bad as that in my whole life. And it was the air that gets the exhaust and the smog that gets trapped down in the temperature inversion kind of valleys that are created there. So that one was. I have others that are based on dreams. I have others where I'm exploring something that I'm just making up out of thin air.
Do you feel when you read, and how familiar you are with other poets, do you feel that most, it's probably a hard question, but do you feel that it's common for poets to write of their own experience? Because I kind of feel that way, but I don't know the genre as well as you do.
Right. Well, that is the area that used to be labeled confessional poetry, maybe still is. I've had poems rejected because by editors using the words confessional poetry, saying that they don't publish that. On the other hand, there are editors who don't want poems that aren't people can't make a personal connection to. It's fun to try it from all directions. It's fun to write vent poems, but then you got to slash them down quite a lot, make a lot of edits to them. And it's fun to write experimental poems. It's fun to write abstract poems. And so any kind of unfamiliar poetic form, you shouldn't write it off as not your style. You should try them all. It is really liberating to try something new, at least for the fun of it. And try modern forms, try erasures, try golden shovels, which a form that a Pittsburgh poet invented, Terrence Hayes. What it is if you haven't, you might have seen erasures before. Those are just words plucked out from other published texts. A golden shovel is to take a line of poetry that you really like and write a poem where each line ends with each word in order in that sentence. That imposes a structure that will, bring things out of you that you didn't expect were going to come out.
Mm-hmm. I just give a shout out for Terrence Hayes, because he was a Pittsburgh poet there for a while. I think he's in New York now, but I had the pleasure of hearing him read a few times. So,
and we should mention you're in Pittsburgh and I'm in New York, so
yes, we get to see different readings, I think. Talking about those different types of poems, can you talk a little bit about the different forms? The other evening, I think when I was talking to Bridget, we were talking about prose poems. And can you tell us about, some of the different forms? Because when I'm reading poetry, there are times a poem is just 3 lines. There's a time, a poem goes on to the second page, and I'm not that familiar with the different forms and why you might want to use one over another.
Well, when you're talking about 3-line poems, the classic 3-line poems are haiku, and then haiku and all of those Oriental forms that are in that family, and they're not all 3 lines. A tanka is a 5-line poem, and again, the form. That short form pulls things out of you that you don't expect. And you might think, oh, a haiku is really easy to write because it's so short. It is really hard because each word has to carry a lot of weight in the haiku. And then, of course, there are the long form poems, the multi-stanza poems, pantoums, villanelles, sestinas, sonnets, and every one of these has certain conventions really worth playing with. For example, a pantoum, which is kind of a poem that keeps repeating certain phrases, has a sort of like a lyricism and melody to it. Kind of like if you listen to a song and the song keeps coming back to the same refrain. And I think it kind of goes back to an oral tradition, even before the written word, when stories were passed down from generation to generation that way, going all the way back to, I don't know, Beowulf. I don't know.
That's that's a good point. I had something in mind. Oh, for somebody wanting to begin writing poetry, I think it's a good idea, or at least it helped me when I had a poetry class, is we took, all different styles of poetry from different poets, and then we would just sort of mimic that style. We would change, of course, what we wanted to say and change the words, but you had something in front of you that you could follow. And, that really helped. Of course, there's the whole thing still like an artist, where you really can work that way, borrowing, artists borrow from each other all the time. But I'm wondering if you find that helpful advice to somebody starting out, or if there's a particular process, once you talk about a good way to start, then what about a process that you follow to complete that poem?
So what you're talking about, using another poem as a pattern, is something I highly recommend. I think of them as response poems. Look at a poem that you like and don't borrow anything from it except its structure, maybe. But look to see when certain ideas switch between stanzas, or maybe the pattern was that the poem started out talking about a personal experience, and then maybe there was a reference to something that happened in history, and then from there was some kind of a surprising analogy to an area that you wouldn't expect to be brought into that poem, and then at the end, try to end it in a way that somehow ties it back to the beginning. Not always, but that provides a good sense of closure, that the poem, even if the reader didn't really understand where you're going, if you end up back in the same territory where you started, there is a feeling of reassurance, like, okay, we have been talking about the same thing the whole time, even though it might not sound like it stayed on the same topic. So.
I was wondering, for poetry, because I'm more familiar with fiction writing, about where you get ideas, because generally speaking, I feel like poetry is more immediate. And because of the generally shorter, so the length, you can't spend too much time building up to what you're getting to. So do you think that it's just sort of just like you talking about the cross country trip, where the car was breaking down, and you had five children along with you. Sounds like a situation ripe for plenty of poems. But so how would you advise somebody who did want to start writing poetry, but they're not really sure, where they should look for subject matter?
So once you decide that you want to start writing poems, if you don't do this already, keep a file of things that strike you, things that surprise you, things that you notice. That'll be your file of writing ideas. What you also, when you start researching poetry journals, there are always journals who have theme calls out. So this month, this magazine is looking for poems about food. Somebody is looking for poems about angels. Somebody is looking for poems about traumatic experiences. And I mean, any topic that you can think of that happens in life is something that might pop up. And knowing that somebody is already pulling, pulling toward. So let me just go back and say an editor is trying to pull poems toward him or her about I don't know, reincarnation. Who knows what it could be? It seems to liberate something, at least in me, knowing that somebody already wants that kind of poem, and ideas just start streaming in. Well, I could talk about this, or I could talk about this. In order to get started, so keep a writing file. If you're serious about poetry, try to start a writers group, which historically, Karen, that's how you and I met, was a writers group that you were, that you actually put out a newspaper ad to try to form. And I don't even want to say how many years ago that was.
Yeah, please don't.
Because in a writers group, frequent feedback is gonna help you keep going. If you need accountability, you can also maybe work. If you can't find a group, maybe you live in an isolated place. I kind of do. You can try to find an accountability partner and talk about your writing goals, and then frequently compare notes and say, how are you doing on that? I have a friend who has a writing friend from graduate school, and they used to have a monthly challenge where each month where someone didn't write something or submit, I'm not sure what the rules were, they had to send money to the other person. If you said that you were going to submit this month and you didn't, you had to send the other person $10 or something. About actually writing poetry, if you are insecure about doing that, especially a lot of us in school had a quick swish through of what poetry was, and we were introduced to, or maybe even asked to memorize rhyming poems, which got the rhythm and the cadence in our ear. And yet most magazines that I submit to specifically say, don't send us anything that rhymes. So it makes your job as a writer a little easier because you don't have to reach so far and twist the language to try to make it do something for you. And you can count this. I'm going to add a couple of, hopefully a couple of writing prompts at the end, but you can consider this to be one already. If you have never written a poem before, write a short paragraph about some insight that you've had, maybe some conversation you've had with someone later, where you were trading ideas back and forth. Write a short paragraph about that insight, and then just start cutting it into short lines. And as you cut it into short lines, you'll see what the strong words are in the paragraph that you've written. And you're naturally going to want to maybe start the poem, your lines with them, maybe end your lines with them. Once you have that, and that's just a draft of ideas, you have something in a poem form on a page. And now you want to go back through and add images. Adjust the sound of it to make the phrasing maybe sound more musical. And try to end with an ending that is less predictable. An ending that has a little surprise in it. If you are talking about an argument that you had with somebody, you don't have the last line be, that sure made me sad, or that sure made me mad.
I was wanting to mention too, because you were talking about joining a writing group, and I think a community can be really important, because writing obviously is a kind of lonely endeavor by itself, and I think you need that break sometimes to have someone to bounce ideas off of, and also to hold you accountable gives you a little bit of a goal. And there's also communities available online now too, especially if you're isolated or you live somewhere where you can't actually find either a writing partner or a writing group. So that's kind of nice that that's available now where it didn't used to be, back when you and I
Absolutely.
first got together. I wanted to ask about the submission process for poetry. I would imagine it's similar to, sending out a short story or even a creative nonfiction piece.
Well, here's my submission advice. When you've got some pieces, so when you've got a group of poems, so let's say you've got your first dozen poems that you've written, and when you've got them as good as you can get them, start sending them out to magazines. You find out where online. You can join a platform called Submittable online, and it has in one of its folders current calls for submissions. There are many of these that you can sign up for. Poets and writers. If you go to the Poets and Writers site, there's always a zillion coming calls for submission. Because, obviously, if you're sending out, then the magazine that you're sending to has to be reading right now, and they all have different reading periods.
Mm-hmm.
Some are really short. There are also journals that read year round. So get a good list of those, and you can send them anytime you want. I don't send. The other thing is, a lot of people will send. The modern thing to do is send out simultaneous submissions. So you have a poem and you send it out to 12 different places. And if one of them wants it, then it goes to that one. And then you have to go to all the other 11 and say, oh, I have to withdraw this one because someone else took it. Mm-hmm. I don't do simultaneous submissions because it messes me up. So I put a lot of effort into keeping track of where the poems are at all times. And I say write so many poems that you don't have to do simultaneous submissions. I also wonder sometimes whether when journals are trying to grab poems that they like that were simultaneously submitted, it's a frustrating experience for them if every poem they go to contact the author about is in the process of going to some other magazine, and then they have to give up on that one.
Right.
So,
and I take it that unlike a short story where you're just sending one story out, you send a group of poems. You don't usually just send one poem to a.
Right. The journal will tell you. And so it might say send 3 poems. It might say send 3 to 6. Some of them only want 1 poem. And I have seen journals reject submissions when they saw that they only wanted 2, but you sent 4, and they just send back a reply saying, sorry, we're not reading your submission.
Right.
So make sure whatever they're asking for, you're sending them.
And each, I notice, I know this is true with sending out for short stories. You have to really read those guidelines carefully because you could look at 10 different journals in a day and all 10 of them want you to submit in their unique way. And so you can't just, you can't really just do a mass send out because they are all so different. It takes a good bit of time to pay attention to everybody's guidelines. Which time consuming but important to do. Like you said, otherwise they are not going to probably not read your submission.
And another piece of advice about that is don't stress out very much about how good your poem is. That really, if you think about it, that's the editor's job. If you got it as good as you can get it and you think it's ready to go, then once you send it out, the ball's in the editor's court. Mm-hmm. And some editors, and they're really busy, and they are trying to pull together these many high quality journals that there are out there. It feels like there's thousands of them, but as they are pulling these together, they're looking at it with an eye to, does it match the their idea for what they had in mind for the magazine. And sometimes you might write a good poem and have it be rejected because they have too many long poems, and you sent a long poem too, and they want to put some short poems in between to break it up a little bit. So you can never second guess what it is. Just send it out, and some really kind editors will sometimes take the time to give you a little feedback and say, I would have liked this if I wish you had done this.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes some of them will say, if you would rewrite this toward this goal, we would take a look at it again. And I've had poems accepted that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sorry, Karen, but I wanted to say that also had brought up the topic of rejections. Big topic for writers. These are just going to become a fact of life for you. And so again, my advice is send out so much work that you get constant rejections, because that takes away most of the power to hurt you. But the thing is that it also greatly increases your chance of survival. Because if you're starting to like where your poetry is going, some magazine is going to too.
Mm-hmm. That's all good advice, Laurinda. Thank you so much. We had a little glitch right there at the beginning with the link, so I'm glad we were able to pull it together and
yes, oh my gosh,
go off there to a little bit of a rocky start, but thank goodness it all came together. And so, do you have a prompt or prompts that you can leave us with today?
Yes, I did too. So I actually, when I watched your conversation with Jen Gavon yesterday, and she was talking about dream logic, and I was really glad that she mentioned dream logic, because that was going to be one of my prompts in my notes. And so if you are working through doing this week and actually trying the prompts on the videos, this one will connect with hers in a way. And it was also dream related, and it was to write down a dream that you remember. Write down a dream you remember, and if you never remember your dreams, then write down a dream that someone else told you about. And if other people never tell you about your dreams, then ask until someone tells you about a dream. Write down the story of that dream, in a shorter form. Don't say it exhaustively. Same thing with what I said before. Now cut it into lines. Cut it into short lines. Don't try to rhyme it. Get to the end and see what story you've told, and what the dreaming mind, your subconscious mind, has a logic of its own language and its own symbols. And so if you want to know what symbols that you're working with from the dream, there are websites where you can look up dream symbols, and then it will let you know, give you a feeling of what the dream was trying to tell you, what your subconscious mind was trying to tell you about your real life. And once you figure that out, then work that into the poem. If you find out that your dream was really about fear, about your fear of failure or something, then once you realize what that symbolism was about, go back with an eye to that and add other imagery that supports that. That's one. Number two is to write an ekphrastic poem. Ekphrastic poem is poetry based on an artwork. It doesn't have to be visual art. It can be any form of the creative arts. But say it as a visual, like a painting. Look to see what it is in there that speaks only to you in that painting. And everybody can look at this picture and see who's in it and what it's about, but what does it mean in relation to you? And then write about that, and make sure you credit the artist as you do it. And you can write a subtitle for your poem based on so-and-so's painting with this title. how are we doing for time? Do you want me to read an example of one of those, or are we heading out of here?
Well, we're going to head out, but if you have a short example, go ahead and read it.
Okay. The shortest one that I have here is a poem based on a dream, so maybe this will help.
Okay.
This is a really old poem, and it was published in Corvus Review. It's called Guru. You showed up in my dream as a fat priest, leaning dangerously over water. You could not discern yourselves, the one waking from the one still asleep. You watched over a green sill, while jackal-headed gods swung in and out of line. And though you knew how to right them, you warned that first you were obliged to swim to safety yourself. And I'll just tell you really briefly what that was about. It was about a counselor that I knew years ago.
I really like that.
Literally showed up in my dream as a priest. So
wow.
He ended up in a poem.
Well, that's what happens when you show up in someone's dream.
That's what you get.
Yeah, let that be a lesson. Oh, thank you so much, Laurinda. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed the couple of poems you got to read, but all the advice, so helpful for anyone wanting to, start diving into writing poetry, or someone who is already, playing in that field. Very good advice. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Thank everyone who joined in. Please, you can add your comments at any time, and this will also be up on live stream, so you can go back and listen to any of the sessions. I think I'm going to go actually back and get all the prompts, and I might try them all this weekend too, because the prompts were really good. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. I hope that you got a lot out of this week, and if you have any suggestions for further creative writing shows, just contact me through my website and we'll put something together. So have a good evening. Thank you, Lori, so much.
Thanks, Karen, and happy writing, everybody.